Hello, welcome to North of 48. We have an incredible conversation with Philip Eitner, who resides in Ukraine, and Professor Ann Lee, who writes a column for the Daily KOS, KOS.
Yeah, sadly, this is one of these things you just kind of run across in Ukraine nowadays. This is a memorial for some soldiers that were killed by Russians. Their bodies were held on the other side of the lines, and they only were renegotiated back here. And so this is a memorial service about 2 months after their actual deaths. Here on Krishachik, in the main part of Kiev, the vehicles that will take them to their final resting places are there, but in a very solemn ceremony. Their memories are thought about here. So, this isn't going to be a long little vlog, but I just ran across this, so I'd make the point. All these flags here commemorate dead people coming out to lay flowers for the bodies of those soldiers recovered from the front lines and previously been held by Russians. And it's one of the things that it's inescapable from my time in Lviv now to my time here in Kiev in the past year of conflict. The toll these people are bearing is significant, but they're undeterred. This doesn't have anything to do with anything else other than I ran across this and I wanted to share it with you. People are dying here and they want this war to end, but they cannot let these deaths go in vain. Now again, they were in sirens. Slava Ukraini. Geroyam Slava.
No, that was actually a powerful 2-minute vlog. So Philip Eitner is with us tonight. He's a journalist based in London, but living in Ukraine. We'll go through that. Previously, he worked for CBS News for 15 years as producer and reporter, a couple of 60-minute episodes, if I recall. And since 2008, he has been a freelance for a number of news outlets, and a regular on Tom Hartman lately, too, right?
Yes.
Right. So you've been a journalist working on some of the most prominent news events of the last 2 decades. He covered the rise to power of Putin in 2000. Following the 9/11 attacks, Philip had a major role in the coverage of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He has reported for many countries in the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, and the European Union. As a one-man band, he was embedded with the U.S. military during the invasion of Iraq. Well versed in new media techniques, he reported the Russian invasion of Georgia. And you have covered the Euro crisis, the war in Ukraine, and the Syrian refugee crisis. I'm honored to have you, Philip. Thank you so much for replying back to me when I got a hold of you on the contact. How did you get involved in journalism, Philip? Was this a passion of yours, or did you fall into it?
No, it was something I always wanted to do since my teenage years, and I pursued a degree and received a degree in broadcast journalism from San Francisco State University. I didn't ever want to do domestic U.S. news, so I got involved with an exchange program in the UK and moved to London after I received my diploma, and have covered international news ever since.
Wow. Well, you sure fell into a quagmire, I'll tell you.
Oh yeah.
lot to report on. I read with interest maybe the backstory on how you ended up in Ukraine. If you could you relay a bit of that?
Sure. I'm in 1998. Uh, uh I had returned to the United States. I was working editor for CBS Radio, and I got an opportunity to become a reporter or take a stint as a reporter in Moscow, which I did. That was 1998, so the tail end of the Yeltsin era and the rise of the Putin era. 2001 was the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, and I came down to Ukraine for that. Wow. As well as the first visit of a pope to Ukraine, predominantly Orthodox Christian country, and in wide conflict oftentimes with Catholicism. So it was a big deal. The Pope would arrive here, and I came down here for that. And having lived in Moscow and immersed in Russian culture, it was striking to me the difference between Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine struck me as a country that had everything that I really liked about Russia, but it didn't have imperialism, and it didn't have schizophrenia as to its sense of self-identity. The Ukrainians know they're European. The Russians are kind of still figuring that out. Are we European? Are we Asian? What are we? Are we something special? Are we unique? And then add to that mix the imperialism of Russia. And I fell in love with Ukraine, and was coming here regularly on vacation, and would come here just to kind of brush up my Russian language skills without having to deal with the visa process in Russia. And also I just preferred Ukraine to Russia. And then in 2014, when Maidan struck, I was here for that. And the uprising of dignity that happened in 2014, I was on Maidan. And then, was caught up in that, and I made some, promises to people on the Maidan that when the eventuality of Russian invasion would come, that I would return and keep the focus and try and cover that eventuality as best I could. So when this happened, I and in the interim continued to travel here. But when the invasion happened last February, felt obligated from the promises I'd made on Maidan to return and kind of keep this in people's eyes, but also to tell the Ukrainian story. So that's what motivated me, and that's why I'm here now.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, if we could talk a little bit about Maidan. You were in Russia, then the Revolution of Dignity started. And so I got a short clip from CBC News to give a little background to the audience here. Maybe I'll just play it if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right. And then we'll bring in Professor Ann Lee.
Ukraine is watching itself chip apart. A truce announced last night was shattered by early this morning. Anti-government protesters determined to retake the square charged towards police. Ukraine's security forces were armed and, given authority to shoot, they fired back. It's not clear who was behind the attacks, but they were deadly and the results graphic. These videos appear to show snipers picking off protesters, shooting repeatedly, even as they tried to move back. The scene was cast into chaos as medics rushed to cope with multiple casualties.
You see their truce? They've announced a truce, but now they throw grenades at us. This is what they mean by truce. We don't trust them.
With tensions high, the government says some security forces were captured. Several police died. It's very hard to control the situation, says opposition leader Vitaly Klitschko. Now we can see that real combat has started. Even at dusk, snipers were still active. We saw a man shot in the head near the barricades rushed to an ambulance inside the square. As smoke cleared, people returned to the scorched earth square, cleaning up. New recruits have come. This woman told us she left her sick mother at home to come here. I can't stay out with all this pain. Kievians should not stay outside. We should be in the first rows. The wood stacking up will be used for flaming barricades, a nighttime defense. The paving stones, potentially lethal ammunition, but they're no match for bullets. This one, he says, is from a sniper's rifle, but there are firearms, some on both sides. After violent attempts to clear this camp, activists are rebuilding. Up until this morning, this ground was occupied by Ukraine riot police. They retreated this morning, and now they're waiting back there, 2 barricades beyond, in a line. This is a brand new defense built by protesters in a day as they fortify their positions. Fierce fighting could flare again, so while urgent diplomacy fails to produce a political compromise, the dynamic here is getting more.
That's from 2014. So what happened? We'll bring in Ann Lee, if you don't mind, Ann.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Hi there.
So the revolution of dignity, or the Maidan uprising, was large scale protests against the government. In short, Yanukovych, the president at the time, was going to sign a European Union contract or trade agreement, and then he changed his mind because the Russians offered him, I think it was $15 billion or something like that, to go the Russian way. And then the protests happened, and they were mostly peaceful until supposedly, was it the Baruch police services were authorized to start shooting people.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, and obviously Yanukovych ran away. They found his presidential palace was just ostentatious. He's rumored to take billions of dollars out of the country for his own personal use. You came from Russia to cover this. What was your take on the situation at the time, Philip? Because I'm just going to paraphrase this. There's some people who think, especially the Russians, they said, no, it was the protesters who started shooting people, and the protesters say no. And I know you were talking to Operator Starsky, who was at the Maiden Revolution as well. So could I get your take on that, please, if you don't mind? And Professor Ann, if you've got some questions after, you go right ahead.
Well, Maidan was the Euromaidan uprising, despite what Russia would like you to believe, was a grassroots uprising. It was largely supported by Ukrainians sick of being under Moscow's thumb. And it was not, I mean, this is centuries in the making. This is Ireland under British rule. This is Algeria under French rule. This is colonial imperialism, that has been fomenting for a very long time. And the history between Ukraine and Russia is really, it's a very dense history, and the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And I mean, we could talk the entire length of this podcast talking solely about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and how that history and that relationship has developed into where we are today. But despite what the Kremlin would have you believe, I firmly, having been on Maidan and lived in Ukraine and spent an awful lot of time in Ukraine, that it was not developed by foreign powers. This was not the CIA. This was not MI6. It was Ukrainians who wanted to be firmly placed in Europe and in the European family of nations, because they don't have the schizophrenia of Russia. They don't have this split identity of, East, West, what are we? I mean, the national symbol of Russia is a double-headed eagle, one head facing West and one head facing East. Ukraine doesn't have that sense of confused identity. They know they're Europeans, and so they wanted to be part of the they wanted a European trade deal. And Yushchenko was actually brought into power with some people saying, we will support you if you agree to this European trade deal. And then when push came to shove and Putin realized that, okay, first a trade deal, and then next, tomorrow it's going to be NATO, or it's going to be actual membership in the European Union, he influenced Yushchenko to deny it with, in essence, a better, you could call it a bribe, say, with a more lucrative deal. He basically tried to buy Ukraine, and when Yushchenko agreed to it and started to move towards cozying up with Putin's Kremlin, the people came out, and it was not, I mean, there may have been, I mean, I don't know, there may have been CIA guys running around here, MI6 guys running around here, but by and large, it was the Ukrainian people themselves who didn't want to be under Moscow's thumb anymore. And this is something that goes back centuries. I mean, Taras Shevchenko, the national poet of Ukraine, was jailed in 1846 because he wrote a poem in the Ukrainian language. I mean, this has been going on for a really long time. So to say it was this kind of NATO, CIA, whatever it was, uprising is to rob the Ukrainian people of their agency. And what I saw in Maidan, and what I have seen for 22, 23 years of coming to Ukraine, is that the Ukrainian people want to have self-determination. They are tired of being a colony. And look, the Western powers have some complicity here, because they have also used Ukraine in the past as some sort of pawn in a chess game of European imperial powers, Austro-Hungarian, Polish, Lithuanian, Ottoman, or Russian empires. Everybody has come through. There's a reason why the etymology of the word Ukraine in ancient Slavic language is to be broken up. So u is the determinative, and krain is the subject. U means in an ancient Slavic language on or upon or near, and krain is ledge or border or line. So it is Ukraina, on the border. And this is the border between so many different empires, and people have manipulated it and used it as a vassal state for centuries, ever since the Mongols in the 10th century sacked Ukraine, it was in the top 5 populated urban centers in Europe in the 10th century. And this is why I have Olga of Kiev on my wall behind me, because this used to be one of the most powerful nation states in Europe, built off of Vikings that came down the riverways and established the settlement here. And it was enormously powerful. And in the 10th century, it was sacked by the Mongols, and ever since then has tried to regain self-determination. And in essence, these people are seeking their own path. They're finally getting their hands on their own history. And to say it was NATO expansion that drove it or whatever it was, ultimately, I contend that we are seeing Ukraine finally become its own nation again after 1,000 years, roughly.
Right.
So whereas we in the States, I'm an American by birth, I'm a British citizen as well, but whereas we had a nation between us and our colonial masters, the Ukrainians unfortunately had their colonial master right on their doorstep. And so they have been deprived of self-determination and sovereignty for 1,000 years. And they finally said, no, we're not. We had an opportunity. This is the third war for independence in a century. Every time Russia is knocked on its back foot, the Ukrainians have tried to gain sovereignty, and they did it in the collapse of the Tsarist era and the Bolshevik Revolution. They did it in the 1930s and early 40s with the conflict between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and they're doing it now. And this is the last Ukrainian War of Independence. This is their 1776 moment, and they're going to get it. They won't stop fighting, and whether or not the West supports them or not, they're going to be sovereign. So, in short, although not so short, I can get on my soapbox. That's what I see happen, and what I saw happen on Maidan, and what I'm seeing happening here now.
Right. Right. The people that you met during the Maiden Revolution, can you talk a little bit about them?
Sure.
If you don't mind. So you came from Russia, and
well,
then...
I was in Russia. I was working at the time. I was working for Al Jazeera, and they sent me to Moscow to deal with or to talk about what was happening in Ukraine from that side of the equation. And so I was in Moscow through much of the Maidan. And when there was a journalist who was here working for Al Jazeera, and then she went to Crimea, and they moved me down from Moscow. It was basically a moving, it was kind of shuffling chairs. She went out to Crimea, so somebody had to be in Kiev, and I was in Moscow, so somebody had to replace me in Moscow. So I came down to Kiev. She went out to Ukraine. Somebody else went to Moscow. Anyhow, I arrived in Moscow the day that Yushchenko fled for Rostov. I missed the exchange, the fire exchange between snipers, but I was here on the ground, and I was able to talk to people who had come. I mean, I had little old grannies, who had come from surrounding areas around Kiev with, the fixings for soup to give to kids who were on the barricades, throwing bricks at the security officials. And they were here because they wanted a free Ukraine. I had two really emotional moment that I still recall and still guides my decision making was, two Ukrainian grandmothers who were in their 80s approached me one night when I was on Maidan and just begged me not to forget Ukraine, because they were saying, we have been betrayed by the West before. We have been ignored. We have been forgotten. And they begged me with, tears in their eyes not to forget Ukraine. And so it was a deeply emotional moment. And I feel in many ways obligated to keep covering Ukraine because the people on the Maidan were really drawing a line in the sand and saying we're not going to be a Russian vassal state anymore. And if you know the history of Ukraine, it is centuries of abuse by Moscow, centuries of denying Ukrainian culture, art, language, identity, and they finally have said enough. And on Maidan, they're repeatedly people were begging me not to let this be forgotten. When the eventual war came, they thought it was going to be earlier than maybe 8 years, but everybody knew the Russians were going to come for Ukraine. Ukraine is the crown jewel in Russia's imperial crown, and it is definitive for the Russians as to their sense of self-identity, which is why they're so determined not to let Ukraine go.
Well, Philip, I think you do those ladies justice with the way you talk about Ukraine and the history, and on the various podcasts and YouTube shows that you go on and mainstream. So well done. And sorry, you got a question?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to thank Philip for the time he's on Tom Hartman. I appreciate that. It's really important to have a kind of live reporting from there that is not quite so mainstream. I guess if I was going to ask questions, it would be I write a little Ukraine blog thing at every day since the war started, and I'm not a scholar in that area, but my interest is the disinformation that I have to wade through every day that rewrites the history of Maidan. It aside from the more explicit, just simply racist and whatever fascist stuff, it is this kind of revising, this sort of retroactive rewriting or kind of revisionism of that history. And since you were there, I'd appreciate sort of your thoughts on how the story has been altered over the time that you've been there. That is the rewriting of that history. I say that because in the former a version of this of a podcast that I used to be on, I would always run into tankies who were telling me that the CIA did it, and that it was America that caused that the agents, as you say, the agency of the people of Ukraine has been lost in the context of this kind of global politics and its media. So I really appreciate your sense of how this story keeps constantly being rewritten, even to this day.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ann, and it's one of the greatest frustrations of what I do here, and it drives me to distraction because it does remove agency from the people of Ukraine and Ukrainian identity. And the Russians are very good at it. Oh my goodness, they study more than anybody else. They study America. They study the West. The Russians do. They study, in particular, the Americans. They know exactly how to manipulate the narrative. They're extremely good at it. I would argue even better in some ways than the CIA. The FSB are masters at manipulating information and creating a narrative. The long and short of it is the Ukrainian people want independence. They want their own future. They want to determine their own future, free from control from Moscow, certainly free from control from Moscow. But make no mistake about it, they will not take instruction from Washington or from Brussels either. Having been a colonial power, they will not bend the knee to any other imperial or other power. They're not going down that road, which is something both Brussels and Washington need to acknowledge. And to be fair to Washington in particular, Brussels is a little bit more tricky. Berlin is a little bit more tricky. London has its own agenda, and they're all kind of playing games. I'd say games. They're all exerting. They're all pursuing their interests. But what they need to understand from Kiev is that Kiev will never be a colonial power again. And that's why we see things like Washington giving, the NATO giving weapons to Ukraine and saying, use it in this way or use it in that way. Well, they take it under consideration. But at the end of the day,
they're not going to be a vassal state of anybody. The battle over Bakhmut. I mean, we know for a fact that the Pentagon urged the Ukrainians not to stand their ground in Bakhmut, and they have been doing that by their own decision. It's what frustrates me more than anything else is the idea that the Ukrainians don't have agency, and that they're just a puppet state of the West. That's what Moscow would love you to believe, and it's not true. It's not true at all. The idea that the place is filled with Nazis and that narrative, that is clearly a Moscow GRU FSB narrative that's being sold. And it's just simply not true. There are far right elements, but what the Russians have done, like, okay, let's take for example the fact that Ukrainians, there is legitimately a very strong movement of Ukrainian nationalists internally within Ukraine. But I would argue that Ukrainian nationalism today is more akin to Irish nationalism in, say, in the beginning of the 1900s, 20th century, than it does the National Socialist movement in Germany. When Ukrainians say, "I am a Ukrainian nationalist," which all alarm bells go off all over the place to an English speaking ear when you hear, "I'm a Ukrainian nationalist." Ukrainian nationalist means I believe that there should be a nation state called Ukraine, which has been deprived them for centuries, at least 5, if not 10. So what they say when they say I am a Ukrainian nationalist, it means I believe that I deserve to live in my own nation called Ukraine. And the Russians know how that sounds to an American ear or an English speaking ear, so they play it up. Oh, these nationalists, look at these nationalists with all these kind of pseudo fascist symbology, which I'm not comfortable with either, but we can go into it if people want to discuss it.
Oh.
That goes back, to kind of Viking iconography.
Right.
But,
Well, let me
sorry.
Let
go
me
ahead.
interrupt it for a second and follow up on that. It is a big question of mine when I look at daily disinformation that uses maps. For example, I have an interest in maps. They show the language divisions in Ukraine and try to argue. And I say I don't agree with it. I think they give you a map that says so many people speak Russian mainly. Well, I see Ukraine more. There is a multilingual quality. It's a bilingualism. Everyone runs fluidly, like Zelensky, between Russian and Ukrainian. And if you could speak for a bit about how you perceive the kind of fluidity, the kind of double coding, as it were, of how a Ukrainian works with the Russian language or culture, because it's there in the history, but it's clear that there is you see yourself as a Ukrainian first, and you have to sort of work with the fact that you encounter the Russian language in your daily life. So if you could give me a sense of that. It's very clear, I know, that from a voting point of view, in 91 and even when Zelensky was elected, that it was a Ukrainian view and there was no Russian at all within that particular context. So if you give me a sense of that, because it's the same problem, of course, in more or less seriously in the differences, for example, in Canada or even in the U.S. with Spanish, the bilingualism issue. I'm sorry, I took so much time asking that question.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm a Russian speaker. I don't speak Ukrainian. And I have never had a real problem. I've had a couple of instances where people have kind of jokingly said to me, as a foreigner, I would rather talk to you in English than speak with you in Russian. But nobody has ever said to me, I refuse to speak to you in Russian, or take a militant attitude towards the language here. This is another instance, I believe, of Russia using or trying to push a narrative where, the poor Russian speakers. Well, you know what? It's not, in my mind, to my experience, and I have been out in Donbass and I've been out in the east of the country. That's not an issue that people are willing to pick up arms about. Let's just say that. There is a kind of a sense of like, we're going to speak Ukrainian in all official capacity, whether it's government or the lingua franca, that we're going to teach in Ukrainian in Ukrainian public schools, private schools. You can have a Russian private school. There's nothing obstructing you. There is no law outlawing Russian, much as Moscow would like you to have you believe. It's the language. I mean, the language issue is so fluid. Where I've been a participant in conversations where one person is speaking Ukrainian, answered by another person speaking in Russian, who then, asks a question in Russian and is answered in Ukrainian. It's very fluid and it's not contentious. And to say that, there are Russians, ethnic Russians who speak Russian in the Donbass, and so that's why we have to come and protect them. So goes the narrative from Vladimir Putin. That's not the case. They're not being Russian, and Russian identity is not being suppressed. It's part of the cultural makeup of Ukraine, and Ukraine is multicultural because it goes back to the idea of this having been a pawn that has been moved on a chessboard by various imperial powers throughout its history. So there are Turks here, there are Poles, there are Germans, there are Russians, of course. There are, people who identify as indigenous, Ukrainians. This has been a place that has been moved between empires throughout its history, certainly the last 1,000 years. And because of that, they are multicultural. They're more multicultural, I would argue, than Russia, which is, Russia is a federation of nation states brought under Moscow's umbrella. 22 different republics make up the Russian Federation, but Moscow is the supremacy. It's the dominant factor because it is a conquering empire. So you are forced to adapt to Moscow. Kiev is a completely different history, which has been a history where powers have moved in and out and shifted, and ethnic groups have moved in, ethnic groups have been more powerful, less powerful, but they have been integrated into a multicultural system where no one single ethnic group has really taken the dominance that we see in the Russian Federation with Moscow. So they're okay if you're a Tatar and you're a Muslim. If you're Jewish, if you're a native Ukrainian speaker, if you're a Pole out in the West, if you're you have Romanian roots in Ivan-Frankivsk, in the Caucasus, I'm sorry, in the Carpathian Mountains. If you're Odessan, this makes up the tapestry of Ukraine, because there was always a dominant imperial power maneuvering things. So the ethnic group was always, there was a mix here in Ukraine, as opposed to in Russia, where Russian dominance to all the different republics. It was a very different sort of composite group. So there really are. Ukraine is a genuine multicultural society, and language is just one of the aspects to that. But it's certainly not fascist, and it's certainly not Ukraine. The Ukrainian language is not pushed on other people. It's just the lingua franca of a multicultural country.
Oh no, it
So
does.
I don't know if that answers
It's
your
exactly
question,
the
but
same
that's
issue about whether English is the lingua franca of India or
yeah, or Ireland. Ireland is a
Ireland.
perfect example. Why do they not? If you're an Irish citizen, you're more likely to speak English than you are to speak Celtic, and that's a
Indeed.
legacy. And that's a legacy of empire. And why Russian is also a lingua franca here in Ukraine is a legacy of empire, but it's not definitive. And anyhow, so much of this war is about the fact that Russia is having a really difficult time coming to terms with the fact that their empire is dying.
Yes. And one hopes that it will, die with Putin in that sense.
All right, join us for part 2 of this incredible conversation with Philip Eitner and Ann Lee. Bye.